the kingdom of Eldariel was a place where gold seemed to flow like rivers, and marble palaces rose up from the earth, as if sculpted by the hands of gods themselves. The royal palace, nestled atop a hill overlooking the sprawling city, shimmered under the sun, its ivory walls adorned with gold filigree and precious gemstones. Statues of ancient kings and queens guarded every corridor, their eyes ever watchful over the kingdom that had thrived under their rule for centuries. The air was thick with the weight of history and power, and those who lived within the palace were always mindful of the expectations placed upon them. The prince, Aldrich, stood at the pinnacle of those expectations. As the heir to the throne, he was a figure of perfection, the image of strength and grace that every subject adored. His days were filled with lessons in diplomacy, military strategy, and the fine art of governance. He knew how to speak to his people with a comforting smile, how to inspire loyalty with a single gesture, and how to charm nobles and ambassadors alike. Yet, behind the facade of the perfect prince, Aldrich often felt the heavy weight of duty bearing down on him. His every action was scrutinized, his every decision weighed against the future of the kingdom. Despite the grandeur of his life, Aldrich's existence felt more like a gilded cage than the free rein of a young man destined for greatness. His personal desires and ambitions were secondary to the responsibilities he was groomed to shoulder. Every day, he was reminded that his life was not his own, that he belonged to the kingdom and to the people. It was a reality he had learned to accept, but that did not stop the occasional flicker of longing for a life outside the palace walls. A life where he could make choices based on his own desires rather than the rigid rules of tradition. Meanwhile, in the shadow of this magnificent palace lived a young woman named Elara. She was a beauty, though few ever saw it, for her life had been one of silence and obscurity. Born into a family that had once held power in the kingdom, Elara had known nothing but control and isolation ever since her mother's death. Her stepmother, a woman named Morgana, had taken over her upbringing, but not out of love. Morgana was a woman of ambition and cunning, and she saw Elara as little more than a tool to be used in her pursuit of power. The young girl was kept hidden away from the royal court, rarely seen by those who walked the grand halls of the palace. Her stepmother's strictness was not merely for the sake of discipline, but to ensure that Elara's beauty, intellect, and spirit were kept in check. Elara spent most of her days in the secluded wing of the palace, reading books and learning what she could from the few tutors Morgana deemed fit to instruct her. But there was a fire within her, a yearning for something more than the life her stepmother had planned. Elara longed for freedom, freedom to live without the suffocating weight of her stepmother's control, freedom to be seen for who she truly was. But the walls of her isolation were too high, and her stepmother's influence too strong for Elara to even dream of escape. Her quiet rebellion, her dreams of a life beyond the palace walls, were nothing more than fantasies that could never come true. That was, until the royal ball was announced. Every noble in the kingdom would be in attendance, and the event promised to be the most grandiose of any held in the last decade. Elara's heart raced with anticipation as she overheard the preparations, the whispers of servants, and the bustling of the royal courtiers as they prepared their finest attire. Morgana, of course, would be attending in her finest gown, commanding attention as always. But Elara, as expected, was to stay hidden. She had no place among the glittering nobles, no role to play in the public display of wealth and power. Yet Elara could not quell the longing in her heart. The thought of sneaking into the ball just once to see the world outside her prison filled her with excitement. She could already imagine the music, the laughter, the sparkle of jewels and silk, and the swirl of dancing figures. It was a world she had only ever heard of in stories, a world that she had never been allowed to touch. The thought of seeing the prince, even from afar, was a forbidden dream she had never dared to voice. On the night of the ball, Elara could no longer resist. Disguised in a simple yet elegant gown she had managed to sneak from her stepmother's wardrobe, Elara slipped quietly through the halls of the palace. Her heart pounded in her chest as she moved swiftly and silently, avoiding the eyes of the guards and servants who might recognize her. She knew the consequences of being caught. But tonight, she was willing to risk it all. Tonight, she would see the world outside the shadows. As she entered the ballroom, Alara's breath caught in her throat. The sight before her was nothing short of breathtaking. The room was bathed in golden light from hundreds of chandeliers, their crystal droplets catching the light like stars scattered across the ceiling. The floor was polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the graceful movements of the dancers. The scent of perfumes, flowers, and the finest foods filled the air, and the sound of laughter and music echoed through the room. Elara felt like an intruder in this world of opulence, but she could not tear her eyes away from the scene before her. Her entrance did not go unnoticed. Whispers spread like wildfire among the guests, and all eyes turned to the mysterious stranger who had appeared without invitation. Elara stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. Her heart raced as she tried to blend into the crowd, but her presence was too striking to ignore. It wasn't long before the prince, Aldrich, noticed her. He had been standing at the edge of the ballroom, speaking to some dignitaries when his gaze wandered across the room. His eyes locked onto Alara, and for a brief moment, time seemed to slow. He was struck by her beauty, her grace, her elegance, and the mystery that surrounded her. She moved through the crowd, with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged. But there was an air of secrecy about her that intrigued him. He did not know who she was, but something about her presence called to him in a way he couldn't explain. As their eyes met, a spark ignited in both of them. Elara quickly looked away, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. She had never expected to capture the prince's attention, much less be noticed by him in such a grand setting. She thought for a moment about fleeing, about retreating back into the shadows where she belonged. But something held her there, a magnetic pull that she couldn't ignore. Aldrich, too, found himself unable to look away. He felt a pull toward this mysterious woman, a desire to learn more about her. Who was she? Why did she seem so familiar, yet so utterly out of place? He had to know more, but the night was young, and the ball was already in full swing. For now, he would watch from a distance, waiting for the right moment to approach her. Unbeknownst to Alara, this brief encounter had set the stage for something far greater. The prince's curiosity about her would only grow, and their fates were now entwined in a way neither could have anticipated. The night had only just begun, and the course of their lives was about to change forever. As the night wore on, the atmosphere in the ballroom grew more vibrant. The prince, Aldrich, found himself drawn to the mysterious woman who had captured his attention the moment she stepped into the room. Her presence lingered in his mind long after he had first noticed her. He couldn't stop thinking about the way her eyes seemed to hold secrets, about the way she moved with a quiet grace that was both alluring and enigmatic. Her beauty was like nothing he had ever seen, but it was something more than that. There was a quiet strength to her, a sense of mystery that beckoned him closer. His chance to speak with her came unexpectedly. As the evening continued, the prince found himself at the edge of the ballroom, exchanging pleasantries with nobles and dignitaries. But his eyes kept drifting to the woman who had captivated him. And then, as if by fate, she came into view again. She was standing near one of the grand columns, looking as if she were lost in thought, and the moment their gazes met again, there was an undeniable pull between them. Aldrich took a step forward, unable to resist the urge to approach her. The music played softly in the background as he walked toward her, his heart beating a little faster with each step. When he finally reached her, he gave a polite bow, but his voice betrayed a trace of nervousness. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said with a warm smile. "I could not help but notice you again. I must admit, I don't believe we've been introduced." Elara's heart skipped a beat at the sound of his voice. The prince, standing before her. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. She swallowed hard, her breath catching in her throat. Her stepmother's words echoed in her mind, "Don't get too close." But in that instant, all the walls she had built around herself began to crumble, and she found herself responding with a quiet grace. I don't believe we have been introduced, Your Highness. Elara. Aldrich smiled warmly, offering her his arm, though he was aware of the tension in her body, the hesitation in her eyes. Elara, he repeated softly, savouring the sound of her name. It is a pleasure to meet you. They stood there for a moment, an awkward silence stretching between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was more like a quiet tension, an unspoken connection that neither of them could ignore. The music played on, but Aldrich found himself lost in the depths of her eyes, as though she held the key to some great mystery. I must admit, he said after a moment, his voice a little softer, I've never seen you before. Are you a guest from another kingdom? Alara hesitated, her mind racing. She couldn't tell him the truth, not yet. Her stepmother had made it clear that she was not to be seen in the public eye, that her existence was a secret to be kept at all costs. But the prince's presence before her, his genuine curiosity, made it hard to resist. I am not a guest, Your Highness. I have been here for some time. Aldrich's brow furrowed slightly, sensing that something was amiss, but he didn't press the matter further. There was something about her, something he couldn't quite place, that made him want to protect her, to understand her. I see, he said with a nod, though he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story than she was letting on. Well, it is an honor to meet you. The conversation drifted to safer topics, and though the words seemed light and casual, the tension between them remained palpable. Aldrich found himself unable to focus on the chatter around him, his mind constantly returning to Alara. He watched her as she spoke, her voice soft but steady, her gaze never quite meeting his for too long. There was an air of sadness around her, a quiet yearning that he couldn't quite understand, and yet there was something about her that made him feel like he had known her forever. In the days that followed, Aldrich sought out any opportunity to cross paths with Alara again. He would find excuses to walk through the palace halls, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. Sometimes he would see her in passing, her dark eyes meeting his for just a brief moment before she turned away, as though trying to escape the magnetic pull between them. Other times, he would find her in the gardens, surrounded by the colourful blooms that filled the royal grounds. She always seemed to be lost in thought, as though hiding from something, but her presence was undeniable, like a shadow that followed him wherever he went. For Alara, every encounter with Aldrich was both a blessing and a curse. She was drawn to him, unable to ignore the growing feelings that stirred in her chest whenever he was near. But with every glance, every word spoken, she was reminded of the walls that separated them, the walls she had built around herself to protect her from the truth of her past. She could not allow herself to fall for him, not when her life was so entangled in secrets and lies. But as the days passed, her resolve began to weaken. She found herself thinking about him when she should have been focused on other things. She wondered what it would be like to be with him, to stand beside him in the light of the royal court, without fear of the truth being exposed. But those thoughts were dangerous. Her stepmother had made it clear that any association with the prince would ruin her. Morgana had warned her time and again to stay in the shadows, to keep her heart locked away. She couldn't risk everything for a fleeting moment of happiness. And yet, Aldrich's presence was impossible to ignore. His curiosity about her grew with each passing day, his questions more pointed, though he still had no idea about the darkness that clung to her past. He had begun to suspect that there was something more to her than she was letting on. He had seen the way she flinched when someone mentioned her stepmother's name, the way she avoided certain conversations, the way she seemed to be constantly looking over her shoulder. It was as if she were always hiding, always afraid of something, but he couldn't figure out what. One day, as the sun set and the golden light of evening spilled across the royal grounds, Aldrich found Alara once again. this time by the fountain in the palace courtyard. She was staring into the water, her reflection distorted by the ripples of the flowing liquid. The moment he stepped into her view, she looked up, her eyes wide with surprise and something else. Fear. Aldrich took a tentative step forward, his voice soft but insistent. "Elara," he said quietly, "there's something about you that I can't ignore. I don't know what it is, but I feel like we're connected in some way." Her heart raced as she turned away, struggling to maintain composure. "You don't know me, Your Highness," she whispered, her voice shaking slightly. "But I want to," he replied, his tone full of sincerity. "I want to know the real you. Whatever it is you're hiding, whatever fears you have, I want to help you face them." Elara's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to trust him, wanted to believe that he truly cared for her, but the walls she had built were too high, too strong. She couldn't let him in. Not yet. But as Aldrich took another step closer, she realized, with a sinking heart, that it might already be too late to keep her secret hidden from him. Elara stood in front of the mirror, her fingers brushing over the delicate lace of her gown, but her thoughts were far from the beauty of the fabric. The reflection staring back at her was no longer just the daughter of a powerful but distant queen. Her identity, carefully hidden behind layers of makeup, the dark curls pinned just right, and the fabricated life she had been forced to lead, now seemed like a fragile mask ready to crack at any moment. She had spent so many years running, constantly looking over her shoulder. But now, the weight of her past felt heavier than ever. As the evening wore on, her mind wandered back to the past, to the life she had once known. Before it was all taken from her. Before her family had been torn apart by rebellion and deceit. She had been young, just a girl when it all began. Her father, a respected nobleman, had been at the forefront of a movement to overthrow the monarchy. They had long suspected that the royal family was corrupt, that power was being abused, and that the people suffered as a result. It wasn't an easy decision, but they had fought with a conviction that could only come from a deep love for their country. But the rebellion failed. The day the royal forces raided their home, Elara could still remember the sharp sounds of soldiers' boots as they stormed through the doors. Her father, once so strong and fearless, was brought down by the weight of the crown, and her mother, who had been nothing more than a shadow of her former self since her husband's capture, cried out to her daughter to run, to escape, to survive. Elara had managed to flee, escaping through the back gates with the help of an old servant who had once cared for her. She was just a child, barely old enough to understand the severity of what was happening. Her heart pounded in her chest, her feet carrying her through the dark streets of the kingdom, until she found herself in the care of someone else, someone who would become her stepmother. Morgana, the woman who had taken her in, had been a quiet, calculating figure. She never spoke of her own background, but Elara quickly understood that Morgana was not someone to be trusted. Morgana had been an ally to the queen, and in return for her loyalty, she had been given control over Elara's life. She'd taken the young girl in and promised to protect her, to give her a life of safety and luxury, but it came at a price. Morgana used her as a pawn. The more Elara grew, the more she understood the twisted nature of her stepmother's schemes. Morgana wasn't interested in protecting her. She was using her as a means to further her own ambitions. When Elara had been old enough to enter the royal court, Morgana had pushed her into the spotlight, using her presence as a bargaining chip for power. The royals saw Elara as a delicate, mysterious figure, a potential match for their sons, a symbol of the old noble bloodlines that had been tainted by rebellion. Morgana ensured that Elara was always in the right place at the right time, but she never allowed her to truly connect with anyone, never allowed her to show her true self. Every smile, every conversation was orchestrated, a carefully constructed act designed to keep the young woman under Morgana's control. As Elara spent more time in the palace, her guilt grew. She had left her family behind, forced to watch the rebellion fail from the shadows of her new life. The guilt of her own survival haunted her every day. But it wasn't just the guilt that consumed her, it was the fear. The fear of being exposed. Her true identity was a secret, a dangerous secret that Morgana had spent years protecting. If anyone learned that Elara was the daughter of the traitor who had tried to overthrow the monarchy, it would mean her death. But Elara could feel the walls closing in. The prince had noticed her, his eyes drawn to her like a moth to a flame. And she couldn't help but wonder, how much longer could she hide? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a knock on the door. Startled, she turned quickly, her heart skipping a beat. She had no time to prepare herself. "Come in," she called, her voice steadier than she felt. The door creaked open, revealing a figure she hadn't expected. Roderick. He was an old acquaintance, a man from her past, someone who had known her before Morgana had swept her away into the royal court. His sudden appearance made her pulse quicken with both fear and a strange sense of relief. "Roderick," Elara breathed, taking a step back as he entered the room, his gaze never leaving her. His eyes were full of knowing, a quiet understanding that sent a shiver down her spine. "You've come far, haven't you, Elara?" His voice was low, tinged with a hint of mockery. Elara swallowed hard. "What are you doing here? You shouldn't be here." Roderick stepped closer, his movements slow but deliberate. "I'm here because I know what you've been hiding. You can't keep running forever, Elara. The prince is getting too close, and hell learn the truth eventually." Her chest tightened at his words. "No, you can't tell him," she whispered, her voice trembling. Roderick smiled, a dark glint in his eyes. "Oh, I'm not the one who's going to tell him. But you should be aware that there are others who are much more eager to see you exposed. You've been living a lie for too long, Elara. The truth always finds a way out." Elara's heart raced, panic surging through her veins. The walls she had spent years building to protect herself, to protect her secret, were beginning to crack. Roderick had always been unpredictable, but now he seemed more dangerous than ever. She couldn't escape him. She couldn't escape her past. The weight of the situation pressed down on her, and she felt the walls closing in. If Roderick spoke to the wrong people, if he revealed her true identity, everything would be over. Her life, her future with the prince, would be shattered in an instant. "Elara, you don't have much time," Roderick said, his tone turning more serious. "I'm not the only one who knows. If you want to protect yourself and the prince, you need to decide who you're going to trust. But make no mistake, you can't hide from your past forever." With that, Roderick turned and left the room, leaving Elara alone, her heart pounding in her chest. The anxiety she had carried for so long was now a living, breathing entity, suffocating her. The time to confront her past was near, and with it, the terrifying realization that she might lose everything she had come to care about: the prince, the life she had dreamed of. The clock was ticking. The grand ballroom shimmered with golden light, 1,000 chandeliers hanging from the high ceilings like stars in an artificial sky. The guests were an elegant blur of rich silks and sparkling jewels, laughing and chatting, their voices blending with the soft notes of a string quartet. But for Elara, the dazzling spectacle felt like a cage that she couldn't escape from no matter how much she longed for freedom. The prince's presence in the room was magnetic, pulling her attention even when she tried to turn away. His tall figure, clad in deep blue velvet, moved through the crowd with a natural grace, his eyes scanning the guests with the careful observation of someone who had spent his life learning how to lead. But tonight, those same eyes seemed to linger on her a little longer than usual. She had felt his gaze the moment he entered the room, and now, as their eyes met across the ballroom, a familiar flutter of nervousness stirred in her chest. His presence was both a comfort and a reminder of the dangerous path she was walking. She had kept her secrets buried for so long, but every time he looked at her, they felt just a little more exposed. The prince's gaze softened, and for a moment, Elara could have sworn there was something more in his eyes, something deeper than mere curiosity. But before she could dwell on it, he was already being pulled away by a noblewoman eager to engage him in conversation. The moment was gone as quickly as it had come, leaving Elara to stare after him, her heart heavy with the weight of her growing feelings. She had never expected to feel this way. When she first met him, she had convinced herself that he was just another royal, someone untouchable and distant, someone she could admire from afar. But now, the intensity of her emotions for him overwhelmed her, making it impossible to ignore. It scared her, how easily she had let her guard down, how easily she had started to care. But there was a reason for the wall she had built around herself. Her past wasn't something that could be easily forgotten, and as much as she longed for the prince's affection, she feared the consequences of letting him in. He was everything she had never been, pure, untainted by the darkness that had consumed her life. How could someone like him ever love someone like her? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice at her side. "Elara, you seem distant tonight." She turned to see Morgana, her stepmother, standing next to her with a calculating smile. The woman's dark eyes flicked to the prince, lingering just a moment too long before returning to Elara. "Are you not enjoying the festivities?" Elara forced a smile, masking her anxiety. "I'm fine, thank you." But Morgana wasn't fooled. Her gaze sharpened, and she leaned in closer. "You've been spending an awful lot of time with the prince. Be careful, Elara. It's not just your past that you have to worry about. There are others watching, others who might expose your secrets if you aren't careful." Elara's stomach twisted at the warning, her breath catching in her throat. She had tried to avoid thinking about the danger her past posed, but Morgana's words brought it all rushing back. Every whispered rumor, every threat, every shadow that had followed her for years. The prince might look at her with affection now, but if the truth came out, it would all be over. Her heart would be shattered, and she would lose everything. Morgana's smile widened as she straightened. "Just remember, Elara, you've been given a chance. Don't waste it." The warning hung in the air, a constant reminder of the fragile world she was navigating. But before she could respond, the prince's voice cut through the tension. "Elara," he called, his voice warm, inviting. "Would you care to join me for a walk in the garden?" Her heart skipped a beat at the sound of his voice. She glanced at Morgana, but her stepmother was already moving away, disappearing into the crowd. Elara turned to the prince, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She had to decide, stay hidden in the shadows or risk everything for a moment of connection. Despite her fears, despite the overwhelming sense of dread that clawed at her chest, she found herself nodding. "I would love to." The garden was bathed in the soft light of the moon, the cool air scented with the delicate fragrance of blooming roses. The prince and Elara walked side by side, their footsteps echoing softly on the stone path. They were alone here, far away from the prying eyes of the court, and Elara could almost forget the weight of the world pressing down on her. For a few precious moments, it felt like everything might be possible. She could pretend that her past didn't exist, that the prince didn't deserve the truth, that she didn't have to carry the burden of her family's downfall. But as they reached the center of the garden, where a fountain bubbled gently, the prince turned to her, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her stomach flip. "Elara," he began, his voice low and earnest. "There's something about you. I can't explain it, but I feel drawn to you. But every time I try to learn more about you, you pull away. Why is that?" Her breath caught in her throat. The walls she had so carefully built up began to crumble. His gaze was so sincere, so full of hope, and yet she couldn't let him in. Not when her past was a ticking time bomb. She opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. She wanted to tell him everything, to confess everything. But the fear of losing him was stronger than the desire to be honest. He reached out, his hand brushing against hers in a gentle, almost hesitant touch. "Elara," I don't care about your past. I care about you. Please, just let me in." The words hit her like a physical blow. She could feel the sincerity in his voice, the honesty in his eyes, but it only made her internal conflict worse. How could she let him in when the truth could destroy everything? "I can't," she whispered, pulling her hand away from his. "I can't be what you want me to be." The prince's expression faltered, hurt flashing in his eyes before it was quickly masked by confusion. "What do you mean?" Elara's voice broke, the weight of her own emotions crashing down on her. "I'm not who you think I am. You don't know the things I've done, the things I've been a part of. If you knew, you would never look at me the same way again." The prince stepped back, his face clouded with confusion and pain. "Elara, please." "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely audible. "I can't do this. Not like this." With that, she turned and fled from the garden, her heart shattering with every step she took away from him. But deep down, she knew this was just the beginning. The prince would never stop asking questions, and soon the truth would come to light. The grand hall was filled with the intoxicating sound of music, the chatter of nobles, and the clinking of fine glasses. The royal banquet was in full swing, an event that was supposed to be a celebration of the kingdom's prosperity. But tonight it felt like the calm before a storm. Alara stood by the large windows, watching the snow gently fall outside, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and fear. She had done her best to bury the past, but tonight it seemed that fate had other plans. Her stepmother had warned her, had told her that secrets never stayed hidden forever, but Alara had never expected the truth to come spilling out like this, so violently, so destructively. The prince had been distant for days, his usual warmth replaced by cold confusion. He had been asking questions, his eyes searching hers with a growing intensity, and Alara had tried her best to deflect, to keep him at arm's length. But tonight, the truth had come crashing into the royal court like a wave, sweeping everything away in its wake. It had started with a single, innocent remark from a guest, one who had known her family from before her fall from grace. Alara had felt the eyes of the court turn toward her as the whisper spread like wildfire, and within moments, the prince was standing before her, his expression a mix of confusion and hurt. "Alara," he had said softly, his voice trembling with the weight of the truth. "Is it true? Are you the daughter of the rebels?" The world had seemed to tilt, the noise around her fading into a distant hum. Her heart raced, her throat constricted, and she could feel the eyes of every noble, every courtier, every royal figure turn toward her. They knew now. The truth was out. She didn't know how to answer him. Her mind screamed at her to run, to disappear into the shadows where she could hide from the repercussions. But she stood frozen, paralyzed by the weight of it all. The prince, his face now pale, stepped back, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Is it true?" he repeated, his voice breaking. The pain in his eyes made her heart ache, but it also stung with guilt. She had lied to him. She had kept the truth from him, and now he was suffering because of it. She wanted to explain, wanted to tell him that she hadn't wanted this, that she hadn't wanted him to know, but the words caught in her throat. Before she could speak, her stepmother appeared, as if on cue, her expression cold and triumphant. "So the truth comes out," she said, her voice laced with sarcasm. "The girl you were so taken with, Prince, is nothing more than a traitor's daughter, the daughter of the very people who sought to overthrow your kingdom." The prince's eyes flicked between Alara and Morgana, his mind trying to piece together the story, but the pieces wouldn't fit. Alara could see the betrayal in his eyes, the hurt that threatened to destroy everything they had built. It was too much for him to bear. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded, his voice now cold and distant. "Why did you hide this from me?" Alara's voice trembled as she tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. She had spent so long hiding from the truth, so long trying to protect him from the darkness of her past, that now, in the face of his anger and confusion, she didn't know how to make him understand. "I did it to protect you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't want you to hate me, to look at me like they do. I never wanted you to find out. I never wanted you to know that the woman you love—" The prince's face twisted in anguish as her words sank in. "The woman I love," he repeated, his voice a sharp, incredulous whisper. "How could you hide something like that from me? How could you lie to me like this?" Tears filled her eyes, but she could not bring herself to cry. The weight of her actions, the devastation she had caused, suffocated her. The prince, the one person who had made her feel alive, feel loved, was now pulling away, and she could see in his eyes that he no longer knew who she was. His gaze turned cold, a veil of icy disbelief settling over him. "I thought you were someone else," he murmured. "Someone better. Someone worthy of my love." He stepped back, his face a mask of pain and betrayal. And with those words, Alara's heart shattered. She watched as the prince turned away, his departure leaving an empty ache in her chest. The court had fallen silent, and she could feel the eyes of the entire kingdom on her, judging her, condemning her. Her future with the prince seemed more uncertain than ever, and in that moment, she realized that her worst fear had come true. Her secrets had destroyed everything. As the prince disappeared into the crowd, leaving her behind, Alara stood alone, her heart heavy with guilt and sorrow. The kingdom's opinion of her was shattered. There was no going back from this. But there was one thing she could do, one final act of courage. Elara took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest as she made her way toward the prince. She had no idea what the future held, but she couldn't live with herself if she didn't tell him the truth. If he was going to hate her, if he was going to turn away from her forever, then at least she would be able to say that she had been honest, that she had laid her soul bare. The prince stood near the grand doors, his back to her as he looked out into the night. Elara approached slowly, each step feeling like an eternity, until she was standing just behind him. "I have to tell you everything," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to keep this from you. But I didn't know how to explain it. How to tell you that I love you. But I couldn't let you fall for someone like me. Not after everything." The prince turned slowly, his eyes meeting hers. The hurt was still there, but now there was something else. Something that made Alara's heart skip a beat. Hope. "I never wanted you to carry this burden alone," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent my whole life hiding, trying to protect myself from the past, but it's time I faced it. I love you, Prince, and I never wanted you to see me as the traitor's daughter. I wanted you to see me as myself. Just Alara." The prince didn't speak right away, but Alara could see the struggle in his eyes. The truth was there now, raw and unvarnished. And there was nothing more she could do but wait for him to decide whether to accept it or walk away. Finally, the prince took a deep breath, his gaze softening. "You should have told me sooner," he said quietly, "but I can see the truth now, and I can't deny what I feel." Tears of relief welled in Elara's eyes. Whatever happened next, at least she had told him the truth, and for the first time, she felt like she might finally be free. The days that followed the revelation were a blur of conflicting emotions for Alara. She had opened her heart, bared her soul to the prince, and had no idea if she would ever be able to rebuild the fragile trust she had broken. His absence was a constant ache, a reminder of what she had lost, yet there was a quiet part of her that hoped, that clung to the belief that he might yet see past the weight of her past. But the prince's silence lingered, and with it, her heart grew heavier. He hadn't rejected her outright, but he hadn't returned to her either. The kingdom had reacted predictably. Whispers of betrayal and distrust floated through the halls of the royal court, and her reputation, once a symbol of grace and nobility, now lay in ruins. Yet amidst the turmoil, Elara held onto a single truth. Her love for him remained unwavering, no matter the consequences. It was in this time of deep uncertainty that the prince sought counsel from his advisors. They were quick to remind him of his royal duty, to preserve the dignity of the throne, to safeguard the kingdom's stability, and to uphold the expectations of his lineage. They told him that Alara's past was too dangerous, too tainted for him to continue his association with her. His love for her, they claimed, could jeopardize everything he had worked for. But the prince, in his quiet moments of solitude, found that his heart betrayed his advisors. He couldn't ignore what he felt for Alara. The memories of their time together, their laughter, their shared moments of vulnerability, these were not things he could simply cast aside. He had been drawn to her from the very beginning, long before he knew of her past. The connection they shared was deeper than any royal duty or political alliance. He stood in front of the mirror one evening, the weight of his family expectations pressing down on him. And for the first time, he made a decision that was his alone. He would trust her. He would love her despite the shadows that clung to her past. His heart told him that she was worthy of love, not because of her family's mistakes, but because of who she was. As the prince prepared to meet her once again, word spread of the stepmother's manipulation. In the wake of Alara's confession, Morgana's true role in the scheme was exposed. Her cruel machinations, her deceitful control over Alara, and her manipulation of the royal court to further her own agenda. The truth was a devastating blow to Morgana, whose power had rested on lies and half-truths for so long. The court, once swayed by her influence, now turned against her. Her position was revoked, her name tarnished beyond repair. For Alara, it was the first taste of freedom she had known in years. She could finally shed the chains that had bound her, could finally begin to heal from the years of fear and manipulation. Morgana's downfall was not just a victory for the prince and the kingdom, it was a personal redemption for Alara, who could now begin to rebuild her life on her own terms, free from the shadows of her stepmother's control. The day after Morgana's removal from the court, the prince sought Alara once more. This time, he did not come with questions or suspicions. He came with resolve. He found her standing in the garden, the same garden where they had first met, the same place where their love had begun to bloom. "Elara," he said, his voice soft but steady, "I have made my decision. The kingdom's opinions, my advisors, they don't matter to me anymore. What matters is you. I love you, despite the past, despite everything that's happened, and I will stand by you, always." Tears welled in Alara's eyes, but they were tears of relief, of hope. She stepped forward, her heart swelling with love for the prince, and took his hand. The weight of her past had not disappeared, but in this moment she realized that the future was no longer defined by the mistakes of her family. It was hers to shape, hers to live. The prince, seeing the truth in her eyes, smiled, a smile that was both tender and full of resolve. "We can't change the past, but we can choose the future," he said, "and I choose you, Alara." And so, in that moment, the future began to unfold before them. With the prince's declaration of love, the kingdom's doubts were quieted. The court, once filled with whispers and gossip, now watched as the prince and Alara stood united. There was no grand ceremony, no declaration made from the balcony, but in their hearts, both of them knew that they had chosen each other above all else. The prince and Alara knew that the road ahead would not be without challenges. The kingdom's scars would take time to heal, and there would be those who would continue to doubt their union. But they were undeterred. Together, they would face whatever came next, free from the shadows of their pasts. In time, they left the palace. They sought a new life, away from the expectations of the court, away from the confines of royal duty. They built a life together, one grounded in love and trust. And though the kingdom would remember their story, they would remember it not as a tale of scandal, but as a story of redemption. a story of love that transcended the past and looked toward the future. The prince and Alara knew that the journey would not always be easy, but as long as they had each other, they were ready for whatever came next. They had chosen each other, and in doing so, they had chosen a future filled with hope, with love, and with the freedom to write their own story.